Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I thought I would have a chat about genre. So, I haven't done like a discussion video for ages, but I thought it would be fun to do one and talk a little bit about genre and the way genres work and the certain like preconceptions we have around certain genres and how my like perception of different genres, my interest in different genres has changed over time. This video is partly inspired by a literary event I went to last week, which was hosted at Waterstone's Tottenham Court Road, at which Caroline O'Donoghue, Aisha Malik, Lucy Vine and Ben Aranovich were discussing chick lit and genre and the way the terminology of certain genres can potentially put some people off books, which I found just really interesting. This event was part of the City Read programme, which is a charity event that happens sort of every year, where City Read try and encourage everyone in London, or as many people in London as possible, to read the same book. And the choice for City Read 2019 was Aisha Malik's novel Sophia Khan is Not Obliged, which is published by Zaffa, which is where I work. So this is why I ended up going to the event, because Aisha is one of the authors whose books I work on. And there were a lot of things that were being discussed at this event, but one of the main things these authors were all discussing was the idea of chick lit and what that term tends to mean and the negative connotations around it and what it covers, which I just found really interesting. Both in terms of talking about chick lit, but also in terms of like using that discussion as a springboard to think about other genres and how genre operates. And it was quite interesting as well because there were three authors who write what could potentially be termed chick lit or more broadly commercial women's fiction, and then Ben Aranovich who writes science fiction and talks a lot as well about how science fiction is often looked down on with a bit of literary snobbery, as is chick lit. And one of the things he raised, which I thought was quite interesting, was that actually while the literary kind of elite and prizes often may look down on these books, actually they are really popular. Sci-fi and fantasy and commercial women's fiction sell incredibly well and do really well and often deal with a lot more serious themes than a lot of people might think. And actually these books do sell much better and do much better and reach a much wider audience than literary fiction. And one of the things that Ben Aranovich said, which I thought was really interesting, was that he said that literary fiction is the gym of the literary world, the thing that a lot of people pay a lot of money for and like to talk about being interested in, but don't actually use that much, which I think is not entirely true. Plenty of people pay for and use the gym and plenty of people buy and read literary fiction, but I do think it is true that a lot of people do buy some of the literary fiction, especially sort of Man Booker Prize winners, and they sit on their shelves for a long time. But it did make me laugh and it did make me think as well, and certainly I found it quite interesting because a lot of the booktubers I watch on booktube are really into literary fiction. I often have in my head that a particular literary fiction novel has sold like tons and tons of copies and is hugely popular, and then actually if I look at the sales figures, that actually isn't the case, and it's just because the particular like circles I move in on booktube tend to like quite literary books. And as someone who works in publishing, I find it really interesting to think about the way we use genre terminology and also the way we kind of package books and position books in a particular place in the market to fit them within a certain genre. And genre has become incredibly important in publishing, and where things sits in the market has become incredibly important in publishing, which can make it hard for a debut novelist who writes things that are slightly in between genres to get published, and also means that sometimes books end up in genres which aren't necessarily entirely the right fit for them because there's something slightly different. But also because of the way certain books are packaged, it sometimes means that people who might like them are actually put off because that package has particular associations and connotations for them, as do particular genre and genre terminology. It was quite interesting as well at this event to hear how people define the term chick lit. If someone said, this book is chick lit, my instinct as a person is that I don't want to read that book, which is silly in many ways, but is partly I think because I don't enjoy the term chick lit, because I don't really like the word chick as a word for use for women. I find it slightly derogatory, but also because when I think of chick lit, what I imagine is a very light read that is entirely romance focused. However, it was interesting to hear at this event what a lot of the audience and a lot of the writers were saying. Their definition of chick lit was what I would term women's fiction or commercial women's fiction, which I see as something more broad than chick lit. And if someone says the term chick lit to me, I assume the book is going to be very heavy on the romance, whereas someone says the term women's fiction to me, my only preconception is that that book is going to have a main female character, which As someone who works in women's fiction in publishing, the main thing that the books have in common on the list that I work on is that the main character is a woman, and that they look at issues which are relevant to women. And so in that sense, I find the term women's fiction quite useful, and obviously that's the term I use in the area of publishing where I work. But I also dislike the term women's fiction because plenty of the books that we publish at Zaffa on the women's fiction list could be read and enjoyed by men, and they're not books that are entirely for women. It's just that they are sort of slightly more aimed at women, but then more women buy books than men anyway by quite a long way, so quite a wide amount of books are slightly aimed at women. And the term women's fiction can encompass a lot of things, and I think a lot of people, when they hear the term women's fiction, also imagine, like they do when they hear the term chick lit, that it's going to be a fairly light read that is very heavy on the romance, which annoys me, one, for the fact that that is what people think when they hear the term women's fiction, as though that is all that women like to read, but I think it's also not true, both of chick lit and like commercial women's fiction, that both can involve romance plot lines, but often that is not the main thing in the book, and often there are a lot of other things being dealt with. And a lot of the like chick lit books and the authors at this event, their novels deal with a lot more than romance. Sophia Khan is Not Obliged by Isa Malik does have a love story in it, but it is actually much more about like friendship and family and religion and work and like finding your way as a 30-year-old woman in London. Like there is a lot more in that book than just a love story, and that is true of a lot of chick lit and a lot of commercial women's fiction. And I think it is quite interesting to see how things are labelled and how covers of certain things work. And I've always found covers very interesting in terms of books and how books are marketed and presented to the world. And I find this even more interesting now that I work in publishing, because covers are there partly to encompass the book, but covers are mostly there to show the reader that this is the kind of book you will like, because it will remind you slightly of other similar books that you also liked, and it will show you where in the market it sits, which means that most covers are kind of there to show a genre. Like that is kind of what covers are there for, which is quite interesting because often the cover of a book dictates what genre it is considered to be in, like more than what is actually in the book. For example, take One Day by David Nichols and Where Rainbows End by Cecilia Ahern. These two books are very, very similar. The plot of these two books is incredibly similar. It has a lot in common. One of them has a slightly less happy ending than the others, but like the broad premise and plot of these two books is incredibly similar. One Day is marketed as, let's say, literary fiction / upmarket commercial fiction. Where Rainbows End, which was also called Love, Rosie, by the way, because that was what the film was called, is definitely marketed heavily as commercial women's fiction / romance. One Day is not a literary book, but it was marketed as a literary book, partly, I believe, because it was written by a man, which is quite common, actually. I've often read books written by men that are marketed as literary, and I read them and I'm like, this is not a literary book, this is a commercial women's fiction book. Like, this has so much more in common with commercial women's fiction than it does with other literary titles. Or for example, take Normal People by Sally Rooney. This has been marketed as quite literary, and if you look at the cover, it looks a bit more literary, but when I read Normal People, I was quite surprised because it wasn't as literary as I expected. If Normal People had speech marks in, that would be a commercial women's fiction book. The only thing that makes it literary is its lack of speech marks, and it's been very interesting to see how Normal People has been going round on BookTube and going round a lot of people who love literary fiction on BookTube, even though I consider it much less literary than a lot of the other books that those booktubers enjoy. I will link down below a video that Claire from Claire Reads Books made talking about how Normal People is a romance novel, because it is. It is part of the romance subgenre of commercial women's fiction. That is what Normal People is, as far as I'm concerned. And I am surprised by how literary it has been treated in a way, and I think that is partly to do with the publishing and the cover and the lack of speech marks, and also the fact that it was published by Faber, who in general publish slightly more literary things. And the same might be said, I think, for Convenience Store Woman by Sarata Murata, which is a translated Japanese novel, which as far as I'm concerned is a commercial women's fiction book. It has a lot in common with books like Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine and several other books in that area, but because it is translated from the Japanese, it's therefore kind of considered more literary than actually I think it is. And I find this really interesting, especially as someone who, until sort of 2 years ago, would have told you that my favourite genre of contemporary fiction was literary fiction. I now definitely don't think that's true. And the more I read literary fiction and the more I delve into other genres, the more I know that I'm not someone who loves super, super literary fiction. But at the same time, there's still a bit of me that enjoys a literary fiction cover. And often I'll see a cover of a literary fiction book and think, oh, that's definitely for me. And then I read it and I'm like, oh no, this is too literary for me. And I found it very interesting since I started working in fiction in publishing. on a list that includes very commercial books and some more reading group / literary books, that actually I enjoy a lot of the really commercial stuff just as much. For example, I had never read a Saga book until I started working in fiction publishing. If you don't know what Saga is, it is quite commercial historical fiction aimed at slightly older women, where the main character is usually a young woman who is like fighting against a lot of social issues and often going through really hard times. Basically, it's just quite fast-paced, plot-driven historical fiction with a woman at the centre. And I've seen these books in bookshop for years, and if I had looked at the cover I would think, oh, that's going to be that's just not going to be for me. But I love this genre so much because, as I said, it's just plot-heavy historical fiction focusing on women, and a lot of the issues, especially Saga books set in the 19th century, deal with are all the issues that I love reading about in Victorian literature. So I love these books, but if I had looked at the covers I wouldn't have thought they're for me. And the reason why they have covers like is to associate them with other books in the genre. So genres kind of get into a hole where you can't do something too different, because if it's too different then the readers who like those other books won't know that they're going to like this book. And I think that's true with a lot of commercial women's fiction books. For example, this is Hot Mess by Lucy Vine. Lucy Vine was one of the authors at the event that inspired this video. If I had seen this book in a bookshop, I probably would never have picked it up because it has a high-heeled shoe on the cover. But hearing Lucy talk about it about the event, it sounded so incredibly brilliant that I immediately went to buy it, which tells you something about what my assumptions are from the cover of a book that I like, but also tells you something about the way that genres have to be and how genres kind of get into a rut of having to have a particular cover so that they appeal to the right people, but that means they also then miss like some more audience as well. But then if they had a very different cover they might miss their original audience. It's very, very complicated basically, and very, very interesting. And another thing I found quite interesting in the last few months is that I have been reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction, and while I have really loved some of the books on the long list and the short list, there are also some that I have got next to nothing out of, like Michael Ondate's Warlight or Peter Carey's A Long Way From Home, because they just really weren't for me, because they were basically too literary, not focused enough, with not enough plot, and a bit too kind of symbolic and complicated, and I just wasn't hooked. I've also noticed in my reading that in general I prefer a more set in stone ending than a really ambiguous ending, and that's another thing that often puts me off literary fiction. Another thing that I struggle with in really literary fiction is very experimental writing or a lack of premise. One thing I found over my nearly 4 years of being on BookTube is that my taste is slightly less literary than a lot of the rest of the non-YA booktubers who I watch, and there have been a lot of books that have been really popular on BookTube that are very literary that I've really not enjoyed, such as The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss or The Crimson Petal and the White by Michelle Faber. And both of those books, along with a few other issues, I found very boring because not that much happened in them, and I think that is because I actually quite like a really plot-driven book. And one thing I know that I have said before on BookTube is that one of the reasons why I love 19th century literature is because in 19th century literature there is really strong writing, really strong characterisation, and also a brilliant plot. And that often in contemporary fiction, the kind of novels I read that have the kind of writing I like don't have the kind of dramatic plot that I like. But actually that's not true. I've just been assuming that the novels that have the writing I like are a particular kind of novel with a particular kind of cover within a particular kind of genre, i.e. literary fiction, because that's what I've had in my head as the thing that I like, when really it kind of isn't. And actually what I like, and what is really my thing in terms of genre, is reading group fiction, which is a term I've never heard used on BookTube, I don't think, but a term that is used quite a lot in the industry. And reading group fiction basically refers to like the more accessible end of literary fiction, and I'm going to say the upper end of commercial fiction, but I don't like to use the term upper because that implies that literary fiction is somehow above commercial fiction, but it's not. But like the more theme-driven / issue-led end of commercial fiction and the more accessible end of literary fiction, that is the kind of stuff that I like. Things that have very complicated characters and are quite thematically heavy at times, but also have like a really strong plot. And one of the reasons why I love historical fiction, aside from loving history, is that quite a lot of historical fiction falls into this category because quite a lot of historical fiction has a really strong plot. Thinking, for example, of authors like Natasha Pulley or Sarah Waters or Diane Setterfield. All of these authors, I would say, write reading group fiction, books that are plot-driven and accessible, but also provide like a lot of interesting, thought-provoking discussions. And I think that's most of the things that I wanted to discuss. I don't really have like a point to this video or any kind of conclusion to make. I just wanted to have a chat about genre because I think it's very interesting, and I think my idea of what genres I like has changed a lot since I started on BookTube, and also have changed a lot since I started working in publishing and since I started thinking harder about what it is that makes books I like. And basically, genre is interesting, books are interesting, and the way we package books is really, really interesting. And I think that's all I wanted to say. I know this has been quite a rambly and jumbled video, but I'd be really interested to know your thoughts down in the comments on genre, how you find the packaging of books affects the different books that you buy, whether it does affect the different books that you buy, and what genres you like and where your reading tastes fall. And I think that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching this slightly incoherent video, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.